November 18th, 1987. Just after sunset, a sheriff's deputy pulls up to a small mobile home outside the town of Ina, Illinois. Keith Dardeen's father was with him. They'd come looking for Keith. When they walked up to the house, something immediately felt wrong. The place was completely dark. No lights, no television, no sound at all. The deputy knocked on the front door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The two of them walk around to the back of the trailer. The deputy raised his flashlight and shined it through the bedroom window. And that's when he saw them. Shapes on the bed. He knocked on the glass, hard. None of them moved, not even a little. The back door turned out to be unlocked. When the deputy stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight swept across the living room and immediately stopped. There was blood. Across the floor, across the furniture, up the walls. The blood was smeared in dull, uneven streaks, as if someone had tried to wipe it away before finally giving up. In the bedroom, 3 members of the Dardeen family had been laid out on the bed. The blankets were pulled up around them, almost like someone had tucked them in. But Elaine Dardeen's hands and mouth had been bound with duct tape, and next to her was her 3-year-old son, Peter. He had been tied up too. And beside them was a newborn baby girl. On the floor nearby was a small baseball bat, a birthday gift Keith had bought for Peter earlier that year. But the man they'd come looking for, Keith Dardeen, was nowhere in the house. For more true crime content like this, please like and subscribe. In the months before the murders, Keith Dardeen began telling people something strange. He didn't feel safe in Ina. He told friends he'd heard rumors about dangerous people moving into the area. Whatever it was, it bothered him enough that he wanted to leave. The small mobile home they lived in had already been put up for sale. Ina, Illinois was a small place. By the late 80s, fewer than 500 people lived there. It was the kind of town where people rarely locked their doors and most neighbors knew each other by name. In 1986, Keith and Elaine Dardeen moved there with their 2-year-old son, Peter. Keith was 29. Elaine was 30. They had come from Mount Carmel, Illinois, hoping for a quieter life. The Dardeens were deeply involved in their small Baptist church. Keith sang in the church band. Elaine played the piano. Friends described them as kind, quiet, and devoted to their faith. By the fall of 1987, their family was about to grow. Elaine was 7.5 months pregnant. They had already chosen names: Casey if a girl, Ian if a boy. From the outside, the Dardeens looked like an ordinary young family starting their life. In the months before the murders, something had started to worry Keith. Exactly what that was, no one's ever been able to say. On the night of November 17th, Keith was scheduled to work the overnight shift. He worked at a water treatment plant in Benton, Illinois, about 10 miles from the family's trailer. Working late hours wasn't unusual for Keith. Not showing up at all was. Keith had a reputation for being dependable. If he was sick, he called. If he was running late, he called. That night, he never arrived for his shift. At first, his supervisor assumed something had simply come up. As the hours passed, the absence started to feel strange. Eventually, he tried calling the Dardeen home. No answer. By the next day, the supervisor contacted Keith's parents. Keith's father, Don, immediately knew something wasn't right. His son wasn't the kind of person who simply disappeared. So, Don tried calling the trailer himself. He didn't get an answer either. He contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department and asked them to check on the family. Later that evening, a deputy agreed to meet him at the Dardeen trailer. What they expected was a routine welfare check. Instead, they walked into one of the most brutal crime scenes Southern Illinois had ever seen. Inside the trailer, 3 members of the Dardeen family had been murdered. Elaine Dardeen, her 3-year-old son Peter, and a newborn baby girl. Investigators soon realized Elaine and Peter had been bound with duct tape. There were also signs that Elaine may have first been bound to a chair before being moved to the bed. The attack was so vicious that she went into labor and gave birth to a baby girl during it. The 3 victims had been beaten to death. The weapon was a small baseball bat. Afterward, their bodies had been carefully placed in bed, with the blankets pulled up around them, almost as if they were being tucked in. Investigators quickly noticed something else about the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. Jewelry, cash, electronics, everything was still inside the home. Outside, Keith's truck was still parked near the trailer, but the family's red Plymouth hatchback was gone. So was Keith Dardeen. In the hours after the bodies were discovered inside the Dardeen trailer, investigators faced a troubling problem. Where was Keith Dardeen? To the officers working the scene, the explanation seemed almost obvious. Man disappears, wife and children are found murdered, the family car is missing. Police began to consider the possibility that Keith had killed his own family. Investigators began searching for the missing man. Nearby towns were alerted, roads were checked, and officers started looking for the red Plymouth. Early the next morning, the search took an unexpected turn. The Plymouth was found just 10 miles from the Dardeen home in the nearby town of Benton. The car had been abandoned in a parking lot outside a bank, just a short distance from the Benton police station. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't pushed off the road. It was simply sitting there, parked in plain view. When investigators approached the vehicle, something immediately caught their attention. Through the windows, they could see dark stains across the interior. Blood. When officers opened the door, the full extent became clear. The seats, the doors, the dashboard. The inside of the car was covered in it. Law enforcement quickly realized the Plymouth might represent a second crime scene. And yet, one question still remained unanswered. Keith Dardeen was still missing. If the blood inside the car belonged to him, then where was his body? Somewhere between the trailer outside Ina and the abandoned car in Benton, something terrible had happened. By the time the blood-covered Plymouth was found in Benton, investigators now had two crime scenes: the trailer outside Ina and the abandoned car 10 miles away. They still didn't know one crucial thing. Was Keith Dardeen a killer on the run, or another victim? The answer came less than 24 hours after the scene in the trailer was discovered. A group of hunters had gone out walking through farmland. About a mile from the Dardeen home, they noticed something lying between the rows of wheat. At first, it seemed to be discarded clothing. As they moved closer, the shape became clearer. It was a body. The man lying in the field was Keith Dardeen. He had been shot 3 times. One bullet entered the front of his skull. Another struck the side of his face. Investigators would soon discover that the gunshots were not the most disturbing part of what had been done to him. Keith had also been mutilated. The killer had castrated him. The discovery instantly shattered the theory that Keith had murdered his own family. This was no fleeing killer. Keith Dardeen had been executed. The location only deepened the mystery. The field where Keith was found sat less than a mile from the Dardeen trailer. Yet, the blood-soaked Plymouth had been abandoned 11 miles away in Benton. Investigators believed Keith may have been killed inside the car. Afterwards, his body dumped in the field. Then, someone drove the Plymouth to Benton and left it there. Autopsies later suggested all 4 members of the family died within a very short window frame, possibly within only a few hours. The most terrifying question remained unanswered. Why? Why would someone slaughter an entire family and leave the father mutilated in a wheat field just a mile from his home? When news of the murders spread, the reaction in Ina was immediate. The small town was stunned, not just by the violence of the crime, but by who the victims were. Keith and Elaine were known as quiet, kind people who were deeply involved in their church and devoted to their young family. As far as anyone knew, they had never caused trouble for anyone, which made the crime even more disturbing, because if something like this could happen to the Dardeens, then it could happen to anyone. The details spread quickly through the community. Elaine and little Peter murdered in their own home, a baby born and killed during the attack, Keith's mutilated body discovered in that nearby field. The most frightening part was that police had no suspects. Investigators didn't even know how many people might have been involved. It could have been one person. It could have been more. That uncertainty changed the way people in Ina lived almost overnight. Doors that once stayed unlocked were suddenly checked twice. Parents stopped letting their children go anywhere alone. Even a simple knock on the door could make people uneasy, because whoever had done this had vanished. As investigators tried to understand what had happened to the Dardeens, small details from the weeks before the murders began to surface. At the time, they didn't seem important. After the killings, they felt very different. One night, someone knocked on the door of the Dardeen trailer. When Keith answered it, he found a woman standing outside. She said she needed to use the phone. Keith refused to let the stranger inside. Friends later said it wasn't unusual for him. Keith was known for being very cautious about strangers and protective of his family. So, The woman was turned away. After the murders, investigators wondered if the encounter meant something more. And it wasn't the only strange detail. One neighbor told police they had occasionally seen a man coming and going from the trailer. It wasn't clear who he was. When the neighbor once asked Elaine about the visitor, she gave a simple answer: a friend of Keith's. Then, she quickly changed the subject. Investigators would later wonder whether that man might have known something about the family or about the quiet routine of life inside the trailer. Because whoever committed the murders seemed to know exactly where to go. There'd been no sign of forced entry, which meant the killer had either been invited inside or the door had been left unlocked. In the days after the murders, investigators flooded into the quiet farmland surrounding Ina. More than 30 officers were assigned to the case. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, church members, and friends. In total, more than 100 people were questioned. The case quickly drew regional attention. A local television station offered a $10,000 reward for information. The Dardeen family added another $10,000. Eventually, the reward grew to $30,000. Tips began coming in. None of them led to a suspect. Detectives did focus on one person, a co-worker of Keith's. There had reportedly been some kind of tension between the two men, enough that investigators brought him in for questioning. For a moment, it seemed like a possible lead, but the co-worker was cleared. He had an alibi. Investigators also considered whether the motive might have been personal. Jealousy, an affair, someone with a grudge. After speaking with friends, family, co-workers, they found nothing. No one believed the Dardeens had enemies. Part of the problem was that the crime itself made very little sense. Nothing had been stolen from the trailer. If robbery had been the motive, the killer had ignored every item of value. Investigators also found no evidence of SA. Keith's murder only deepened the mystery. His family had been beaten to death inside the trailer. Keith, however, was shot and mutilated. As investigators searched for answers, they considered a wide range of possibilities. Some were suggested by detectives. Others came from members of the Dardeen family. None of them fully explained what had happened. One theory suggested the attack may have been personal. The violence inside the trailer had been extreme, and the mutilation of Keith raised the possibility that someone had targeted him out of jealousy or resentment. Another theory suggested something very different. Some family members wondered whether Keith might have been pressured by someone involved in drug activity, and that the murders could have been a brutal act of retaliation after he refused to cooperate. Law enforcement also briefly explored whether gambling might have played a role. Sports scores had been found inside the trailer, raising the possibility that Keith had been placing bets. Those who knew him dismissed that idea quickly. Keith was known for being extremely careful with money, the kind of person who saved spare change for his son's college fund. And like many violent crimes during the late 1980s, the case was briefly swept up in the fears of the time. Rumors spread that the murders might have been connected to satanic cult activity, part of what would later be known as the Satanic Panic. Investigators quickly ruled that out. The crime scene showed none of the symbols or patterns typically associated with ritual killings. In the end, every theory ran into the same problem. None of them could be proven. None of them explained every part of the crime. But one detail about the Dardeen home continued to stand out: the railroad tracks. Freight trains passed through the southern Illinois countryside at all hours of the night, cutting straight through the small town of Ina. And just across the road from those tracks sat the Dardeen trailer. For years, that detail meant nothing. But later, investigators began to wonder whether it might. Because there was a man who used those tracks like highways. His name was Angel Resendez. He would eventually become known as the Railroad Killer. Resendez traveled across the United States by hopping freight trains, slipping off in small towns in the middle of the night. Many of his victims lived in houses near railroad tracks, and several of them had been beaten to death inside their homes. The pattern was chilling. Resendez would step off a train, find a house near the tracks, enter while the occupants were inside, and attack. Then, he would simply disappear, back onto the rails, back into the darkness. Years later, when investigators reviewed the Dardeen case, the similarities caught their attention. The Dardeen trailer did sit directly beside the railroad line, and Elaine, Peter, and the newborn had been killed by blunt force trauma, the same method Resendez used in several of his attacks. It raised a disturbing possibility. The killer might not have been someone from Ina at all. He might have simply stepped off a passing train, walked across the road, and into the Dardeen home. Resendez was eventually arrested in 1999 after a series of murders across the United States. When investigators tried to connect him to the killings in Ina, they ran into a problem. There was no evidence placing him there. No witness, no physical evidence, nothing tying him to the Dardeen family. In the end, the theory remained exactly that, a possibility. The question that had haunted the town of Ina since 1987 remained unanswered. If it wasn't a killer passing through on the rails, then who had done this? More than a decade after the murders, the case took a strange turn. A drifter named Tommy Lynn Sells began confessing to murders. Sells had left home at 13 and spent much of his life drifting across the country, working odd jobs and traveling with the carnivals. Over the years, he claimed responsibility for dozens of killings. In 1999, Sells was arrested after breaking into a home in Del Rio, Texas. Inside the house were two young girls, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris and her 10-year-old friend Crystal Searles. Crystal woke during the night and saw a man standing in the room. She watched as he slashed Kayleen's throat. He noticed her. Then he cut her throat too. Kayleen died. Crystal survived by playing dead, before walking nearly a quarter-mile to another trailer for help. Unable to speak, she had to write down what had happened. Her bravery and her description helped police identify the attacker, Tommy Lynn Sells. After his arrest, Sells began confessing to murder after murder. Among them were the killings of the Dardeen family. In one version of the story, Sells claimed he met Keith Dardeen at a truck stop near Mount Vernon. The two men talked, and Keith eventually invited him back to the trailer. Sells claimed Keith and Elaine had propositioned him for a threesome, something the Dardeen family later said made no sense at all. In another version of the confession, Sells said he simply hopped off a freight train near Ina. He claimed he saw a for sale sign outside the Dardeen trailer, knocked on the door pretending to be interested in buying the property. According to Sells, Keith let him inside. From there, Sells said he forced Keith to tie up Elaine and Peter. He drove Keith away from the trailer into a nearby field. He claimed he shot him and mutilated his body. Afterward, he said he returned to the trailer and murdered the rest of the family. But investigators quickly noticed problems. Some details of Sells' confession appeared to match the crime. Others did not. For example, Sells claimed he essayed Elaine. Investigators found no evidence of that. Supporters of the confession point to one unusual detail. Sells described a set of watermelon-themed dishes that were supposedly inside the Dardeen trailer. To some, that seemed like proof he'd been there. Critics say the detail may not be as convincing as it sounds. According to some reports, Sells was allowed to make multiple guesses about items inside the home before landing on something investigators considered accurate. Also, watermelon-themed dish sets were widely sold in the 80s. As Sells continued talking, his story became less consistent. Details changed, timelines shifted. In the end, investigators were left with the same question. Was Tommy Lynn Sells telling the truth? Or was he simply adding another crime to the long list of murders he claimed to have committed? There was never any physical evidence linking him to the murders in Ina. In 2014, Sells was executed in Texas by lethal injection for another murder. And with his death, the questions surrounding his confessions were never fully resolved. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to tell you something that didn't make it into any official reports. And I'm going to say this up front. This is one of those stories where some parts are documented and some parts are very much small-town rumor. So we're going to separate the two as we go, because this one is weird. Years after the murders in Mount Carmel, about an hour away from where everything actually happened, a homeowner was doing renovations. Just normal stuff, peeling back old wallpaper. And underneath, there was writing. Not just random scribbles. Names. The Dardeen family's names, written directly onto the wall. And it wasn't just a list. People who claim to have seen it say it read almost like a confession or a boast. Like someone saying, "I did this." Here's the creepiest part. Among the names was Casey. You know, the name Elaine chose for her unborn baby? That wasn't public knowledge at the time. That was private, family only. How does that end up inside a wall? Now, this next part is confirmed. Authorities took it serious enough that they didn't just photograph it. They cut the section of the wall completely out of the house, took it into evidence. And then, this is where things start to get murky, because after that, nothing. No DNA results released. No handwriting analysis made public. No follow-up. Just silence. which of course is where the rumors really take off. That maybe they did figure out who wrote it, and maybe that person was already dead. Or maybe it was someone they couldn't or wouldn't touch. And here's one last detail that people in the area don't like to ignore. This wasn't in Ina, where the murders happened. This was in Mount Carmel, Keith's hometown, which makes some people wonder, was this random? Or was someone watching the Dardeens long before anyone realized they should be afraid? It's the kind of story that sticks. The kind that makes you look at old houses a little different, and maybe not peel the wallpaper back too far.
Ready? Yeah. Can you count?
In the years after the murders, the investigation into the deaths of the Dardeen family continued. Detectives reviewed evidence, followed new leads, re-examined old ones. Answers never came. Investigators still can't say exactly what happened inside the trailer that night. They can't say why the family was targeted or who did it. Keith's mother, Joanne, tried repeatedly to get attention on this case, to get it in front of anyone who might help, including major shows at the time. Unsolved Mysteries, The Oprah Show. They refused to cover it. Too brutal, they said. All the more reason to bring attention to the case, I say. Was this really random? Or did someone know exactly where they were going and who they were going there for? Almost 4 decades later, those questions are still unanswered. Cases like this don't solve themselves. They're solved because someone remembers something small, something they didn't think mattered at the time. So I'll leave you with this. If you heard something, then or after, if you saw something, no matter how small, it might matter more than you think. Because for the Dardeen family, the question has never really changed. It's not just who did it, it's why. The next time you hear the rumble of a train in the distance, just remember, in the quiet town of Ina, the freight trains still pass through the night.
I scan the streets with tired eyes. Neon signs, they blur in light. Every face a question mark, a puzzle piece in the dark. Where are you? Where did you go? I've been chasing shadows in the road. Every corner I turn, I'm spinning around, still